welcome to the TheFutureEconomy.ca's live panel and Q&A on discussing Canada's energy future. This session is part of our series on Canada's future energy pathways presented by Shell Canada. My name is Florent Thévenard. I'm the director of the TheFutureEconomy.ca, and I will be your host for today's session. We have more than 60 people following us from all around Canada and abroad. I'm sure more are trickling in as we speak for this conversation. Given the challenging context that we find ourselves in globally, of course, I just want to acknowledge that and say that I hope everyone is well and staying healthy. While this is a virtual event, I'm here in Canada, and therefore we'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'keha, or the Mohawk, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. Knowing we're all connecting from various locations around Canada and the globe, I would encourage each of you to take a moment to reflect on the traditional land from which you are connecting and consider your personal connection to that land. So our panel will last about 40 minutes and there will be a Q&A at the end. Throughout the session, we invite you to type your questions in the chat box and state your name and organization, please, before your question. We will also run 2 anonymous polls to assess your feelings related to today's topic, one at the beginning and one at the end. You will see the polls pop up on your screen, and we ask you to choose your answer as soon as you see it. So today we're going to be discussing Canada's energy future, where our national conversation stands right now, who the main stakeholders are, the impacts of COVID-19, and the collaborations that must be formed to drive the energy transition forward. We will also look at global examples that we can emulate in our transition and what must be done now to design a more inclusive and low-carbon future here in Canada. The discussion will finish with calls to action from our panelists, which I'm going to introduce to you right now. And they should pop up on your screen. So we have Mallika Ishwaran, who's actually joining us from Delhi, and she is the Senior Economist and Policy Advisor in the Shell Scenarios team in London, UK. We have Monica Gattinger, who is the Director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa. And we have Ed Whittingham, the co-founder of the Academy for Sustainable Innovation and co-host of the Energy versus Climate podcast series. Thank you all for joining us. So my first question, I'll start reading it now already, will be who are the main stakeholders in Canada's energy conversation? What does it look like? What is the tone of that conversation? Is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic? Is it uncertain? Is it, on the contrary, confident? And maybe that's a rhetorical question, how polarized is that debate in Canada? So I'm going to turn that question first to Monica.
Great. Thank you very much, Florent, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate here today. So I'm going to focus my answer actually on the question of polarization. We've been doing a lot of work on this at Positive Energy, and I think what I would say is that there are really 4 groups that I'd point to in response to the question, and as you move through these groups, things get more and more polarized. So let's start with the general public. One of the things that we've done in our work is to draw the distinction between polarized opinion and fragmented opinion, with polarized opinion being, opinions that really cluster at either end of a spectrum, versus fragmented opinion where people might disagree about the issues, but they're not sort of clustered on either end of a spectrum. Their opinions are distributed across various opinion categories. And what we've seen with our work is that, Canadians' opinions on energy and environmental issues, even on controversial topics like pipelines or carbon taxes, they're not as polarized as commonly believed, which is very important from our perspective because that suggests there's more room for compromise than many might think on these issues. So that's the general public. Second group is communities. Communities tend to get engaged in the issues when it comes to individual energy projects, and certainly things can get polarized there. But our research has really shown, what people are looking for most in decision-making processes is processes they can have confidence in. They're fair, they're transparent, they're open, they're equitable. The third group, and this is where things start to get a little more divisive, is energy and environmental leaders. So we've done a lot of work trying to get a better understanding of where environmental and energy leaders stand when it comes to their views about Canada's energy future in an age of climate change. And here we see two very different realities coming forward in terms of different pace and scope when it comes to transition. And so in many instances, folks are actually talking past one another. And then the fourth group is politicians. And I think this is where we have some real challenges in Canada because energy and climate issues have become polarized along partisan lines. Think pipelines, think carbon taxes, think the future of oil and gas. And that makes for real challenges when it comes to advancing Canada's energy discussion.
I'm going to turn it to Ed now. Of course, you've worked sort of at the intersection of the environmental movement with the Pembina, and of course, you're still doing work with the Academy for Sustainable Innovation. But you've also worked collaboratively with the energy industry. And I think it's fair to say that the polarization is often seen as environmental on one end and energy on the other. What would you say to what Monica just said right now?
Yeah, so, and thanks, Flo, for inviting me to join the discussion. Hello from Treaty 7 land. I think if you take that, and I hate to use the word leaders, but I will, if you use energy and environmental leaders, it does feel pretty polarized right now. And, you know, I was part of conversations back in 2015 that involved CEOs of 5 major oil and gas companies, executive directors of 4 major national environmental NGOs, where we had quiet conversations to try to seek a break in the impasse, particularly to do with Western Canadian oil and gas issues. And we had them over multiple months. You know, we're talking 18 months, and our recommendations really had a large influence on the then Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, and I would say by extension on the federal government's Pan-Canadian framework. I don't think you could do that right now. I really don't. And partly it's because in that time, if anything, in that segment that I thought, Monica, you spoke very well of, it has become more polarized, and we've had polarizing issues, and frankly, actors in those camps who have taken polarizing tactics. And I look at the clean fuel standard as one example, where right now it's incredibly polarized, and you can't go a week without reading 3 articles about why this one policy would bring down the destruction, say, of Canada's energy sector, which I think is polarizing. So if you think, and I'll leave this open, if you think that we need that happy middle ground and we need to get into conversations that are productive and without the polarization, I would say it's very difficult to do that among certain segments.
I want to ask you both for a very quick, literally 30 seconds follow-up. There are many macro trends at play, of course. Canada does not exist in a vacuum. And the elephant in the room, so to say, right now is obviously COVID-19. I'll let you continue, Ed. How has COVID-19 impacted those conversations in your view?
Well, without question, COVID-19, like people, over the short term at least, their focus is elsewhere. And, you know, I'll let everyone know, I've just had 2 kids sent home from 2 different schools within 45 minutes of each other because of COVID exposure, indirect COVID exposure. So you can imagine where my mind is at right now during this panel. So we've had tremendous distractions, but I think once we turn the corner of COVID, if you look, I'm sure we'll speak more about this, climate has been a top issue in Canada in the last federal election. I think it will continue to be so. But no surprise, we're focused on COVID and short-term health and economic priorities as we should right now.
And Monica, you're in Ottawa, the national capital, and perhaps closer as well to government and all those national policy conversations. What has been the impact here in Canada?
I would agree with Ed, but I'd add as well that I think, there are many folks who, and perhaps I shouldn't state it quite so baldly, but are looking to seize opportunity in the midst of a crisis, right? And so we've had a lot of discussion in Canada around what does the future look like, building back better, and the like. And so, very early in the pandemic, one of the things that we turned our minds to was, is this likely to actually unite Canadians around energy and environmental issues, or is this likely to actually further polarize, particularly those in the leaders space? And I think what we found is actually the latter. not the former. That there hasn't necessarily been that coming together that one might have imagined. Instead, there's been, a lot more of folks seeing an opportunity to try to put forward their agendas rather than trying to develop a pan-Canadian approach to the issues.
And Mallika, I want to turn to you now. Of course, you are typically based in London and you're in Delhi now, so you can bring us some global perspective, perhaps on some of those macro trends that I referred to earlier. And of course, you work with scenarios too. So lay the global context that influences those conversations here in Canada, please.
Great. Thanks a lot, Flo, and really a pleasure to be on this panel. As you said, I work in the scenarios team at Shell, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the long-term trends and issues facing the energy system and wider society. I mean, over the last few years, we spent a lot of time thinking about the energy transition globally and what that means in different countries and how to make progress on it. Of course, the pandemic has just been sort of an unprecedented disruptor, if you like, in terms of social and economic activity. And really, so it has, you can imagine it having quite a fundamental impact on how the energy transition progresses from here on out. Now, so being the scenarios team, we recently put out a set of scenarios called Rethinking the 2020s, which is very much looking at different ways and approaches that governments could take in sort of recovering and moving beyond the pandemic over the course of this decade. Now, we have 3 scenarios called health, wealth, and security. Now, health is very much a sort of a health-first kind of scenario where you look, the governments respond to the public health crisis and the economy opens in a much more measured way as the health outcomes are improved. You have wealth, which is sort of flipped the other way around, where the imperative to open the economy is quite high. And so the economy is opened and adapted to the situation with the pandemic. So that's sort of a different approach. And then you have security, where the response to the pandemic is much more inward looking and securing your physical and your economic prosperity within your borders. Now, each of these has different implications for the next 10 years in terms of energy transition. So for a security scenario, you don't get the global coordination that's needed to drive the action to reduce and tackle climate change. For wealth, you end up building back traditionally. So you build back the way things are today rather than sort of anticipating what's needed for the energy transition. And the health scenario builds back in a way that's much more what Monica was saying around building back better. And so again, you see quite different pathways for which how the post-pandemic world then interacts with how the energy transition is going. Now, when we look around the world, we see actually a range of responses. There are some countries that are choosing the security first kind of approach. There are those that are choosing the wealth first kind of approach. And then you also see the health approach. So I think there's a range of spectrum of responses that you're seeing governments take in response to this. And from our perspective, what sort of matters is that, 30 years, which is what it is to 2050, for the world to decarbonize, is a fairly short time frame. And if you lose 10 years because of the post-pandemic sort of response, then that just increases the cost and the challenge of then meeting these targets for 2050. I think there are a lot of choices in front of governments in terms of how they build back after this pandemic, and that really will have an impact on how quickly we make this transition to low carbon.
And a quick follow-up as we transition, to use your word, to the second topic, which is collaboration. Shell, of course, is a very large international or multinational player. And of course, a transition like the one we're talking about is a massive endeavor. It's a global endeavor. We will need sort of all hands on deck, whether it be the energy industry itself, governments, environmental NGOs, citizens, etc. Why is collaboration then so fundamental to this transition? I mean, how do you see those collaborations, the ideal collaboration, let's say, playing out?
So I think, the energy system touches every part of not just the economy, but of our lives. So when you're thinking of transitioning the energy system from what it's based on today to something entirely different in the future, it's not just a process of technology or the economics coming in. It's a process of social change and progress. And so it requires all parts of society to be working together to deliver that change. Now, what we usually say is that, when we do our scenario analysis, and in 2018, we actually published a scenario called Sky, which looks and sets out a pathway for how the world could achieve the ambitions of the Paris Climate Agreement. And one of the things we say in the context of that scenario is that you need to rewire the entire global economy in the course of 30 years. Now, this sort of massive effort really requires, you need governments in there sort of putting the right policy frameworks in place to encourage investment in these new technologies, to encourage investment in infrastructure. You need businesses like Shell coming in to then produce those low carbon solutions, produce new business models that then support those solutions. And then, last but not the least, you need consumers coming in and providing a pull, sort of demanding low carbon products and services. And when you have these three aligning, that's when you have that sort of, a momentum that you need to make this sort of change over the course of just 30 years.
And turning to Ed again, as I said earlier, you've been, sort of at the connecting point between energy and the environmental community. We live in an era of fake news. Let's just call it as it is. And so on both sides, or there are probably more sides, there is a lot of disinformation and simply as well, lack of perhaps appreciation or understanding about our energy systems and its complexities. How can we make those discussions more inclusive, less elitist, and frankly, better informed?
Sure. I'd challenge Flo with respect the notion that these conversations are elitist. Perhaps that was the case 10 years ago, and you say, yeah, I've been doing this now for far too long. Used to be I'd go to a conference when you could do these things in person, and you'd have it sit at a table of 10. There'd be, 8 of these tables around the conference room, and at the table of 10, there'd be 6 people from industry who generally speak with one voice about an issue. There'd be 2 from government who didn't feel they could say what they really thought. There would be myself, the token NGO rep, and then there would be an academic like Mallika, and Mallika, a little jab, but the academic would say, well, why can't the world be like what our model says the world should be? And that was it. So that gets to Monica's cohort of energy and environmental leaders. But I don't think it's the case anymore. And there's real evidence that climate is ticking up as an issue. And if you look at last year's election, the 2019 election, 63% of Canadians voted for a party that had a strong, not just a climate platform, but a strong climate platform. And climate was consistently a top 3 issue, and in some polls it was the number 2 issue. So personally, I feel confident now saying that climate and energy issues, they used to be like corporate boardroom table discussions or editorial boardroom table discussions or cabinet table discussions. They've solidly moved around the kitchen table. And for myself, I look at, the youth movement, the power of the Fridays for the Future, or even the U.S. I don't agree with all of their positions, but the Sunshine Movement, it feels like a bit of a social reboot right now.
And Monica, there are some similarities between the work you and Ed do, I suppose, in terms of trying to depolarize those conversations. Do you agree with Ed, first of all, and anything to add to how we can further depolarize?
Well, I think, again, not that you want to be challenged again, Flo, but I am going to do it a little bit. I think we need to be careful, too, about, once we started talking about issues as being polarized, it's like you're carrying the polarization hammer, and every debate you see, you start to see it as being polarized. So I think we do need to be careful about, not assuming things are perhaps worse than they are. And some of our research, notably with the general public, suggests that's not the case, certainly among the general public. That said, these are divisive issues, energy and climate issues, as both Ed and Mallika mentioned. There are no silver bullets. Progress can be had, but it's going to be hard won, and it may very well be more incremental than many would like. So I think, I'd begin by saying, a couple things. First, recognize the scale of the challenge. Mallika pointed to that very eloquently. I think also, particularly for Canada, recognize that oil and gas is going to be in the global energy system for decades to come. There's a lot of work that strongly suggests that's going to be the case. And I think what that really means is an all of the above strategy. You said all hands on deck, Flo. I completely agree with that. And yet many of our debates focus quite narrowly on things, whether it's in electric vehicles, wind and solar, but it's going to take a whole suite of technologies and energy sources to reduce emissions. I think the final thing I would say, is for Canada as a producer of oil and gas, sometimes it's useful to draw the distinction between energy at home and energy abroad. Right, so domestic climate action, but also looking at, in a world where oil and gas is going to continue to be part of the global energy system, where does Canada want to position itself in that, and how does it want to try to be cost and carbon competitive in terms of its oil and gas exports?
Flo, if I could just jump in quickly, I actually don't think we need to worry about Canada in terms of the climate energy debate and being at the forefront and polarized in some pockets, but generally we're tracking well. We need to look south of the border. The world's greatest economy, the largest economy. You've got a president-elect who's promised a $2 trillion plan that would touch every part of the U.S. economy, and climate ranked about 11th in terms of importance. It was south of abortion. So for us to get any parts of those plans, have general public debate about it in the U.S., you really need to increase concern and awareness of it.
That's a very interesting point indeed. I want to remind all of our participants that if you want to ask questions, and I do see some trickling in, I just don't have time to look at them carefully, please do so in the chat box, and if possible, include your name and your organization. So we're about halfway. I want to move to our third topic, which is going to be turned mostly to Mallika and is around global cooperative approaches. Mallika, is there a country, or are there countries around the world that are, let's say, leading in the energy transition, that have found a model that really works, and also a way to have healthy conversations within their countries?
So that's a really interesting question, because I think the energy transition is well underway. So you see that in all countries across the world, advanced, emerging, developing. You see the elements of the energy transition. I mean, one thing that I would say is that the transition will look very different in different places. So, the conditions or circumstances of a particular country, their preference, cultural preferences in terms of how you respond, role of government, these are all factors that will determine sort of the nature of the energy transition in different countries. For example, I'm here in Delhi. It's very different. The kind of conversations you have around energy transition is very different to what you would have in an advanced economy like the UK, where I live. Similarly, resource-rich countries like Canada, both renewables and fossil, I would point out, will have a different discussion from countries that don't have that sort of abundance of resources, say like Japan. So I think for us, we very much see the energy transition looking and feeling very different in different parts of the world. But that said, there are some key sort of 3 points, I would say 3 common factors that would need to feature in order to make progress. One is, I think there's a role for businesses to come together to demonstrate what needs to change and how to change. So, for example, we're a member as Shell of an initiative called the Clean Skies for Tomorrow, which is an aviation sector initiative. And we brought sort of airlines, us as fuel suppliers, airports, sort of different players in that sector together to say, how can we make progress while not waiting for each other? How can we all decide to do this? So I think there's a role for that sectoral sort of coalitions to start the ball rolling and get the momentum going. I think that can go hand in hand with then going and working with governments to say, what kind of policy frameworks do you need to then amp up this action? So we've demonstrated that we can take these sort of actions at amongst willing players. But what do we need to make this more widespread? What sort of frameworks? And then the third point I think is absolutely crucial, is to make sure that this is an equitable and inclusive transition. Because again, as I said, you've just got 30 years to make this sort of fundamental change. And if you don't take people with you, and if you don't have that buy-in from society, that pace of change will just not be adequate enough. So for me, those sort of are the three sort of elements that would sort of feature in common across the different types of energy transitions we're likely to see.
Thank you, Mallika. I'm looking for Monica. I thought you wanted to comment.
Yes, I did actually. I really agree with what Mallika has just said. I think, no country has an ideal model. This is really hard, right? It's much easier to make climate commitments than it is to achieve them. Moving from the what to the how is the $64,000 question, as they say. And, and again, I appreciate Ed's comment earlier about academics, but I actually happen to be an academic that says much the opposite, which is that, moving from the what to the how, this is where the real world of politics, economics, technologies, energy systems, environmental issues, all of these things come into sharp focus. And the countries that are going to be the most successful, in my view, are those that are going to adopt what I think of as integrated approaches, right? That they're solving simultaneously for climate and energy imperatives, as well as for broader social and environmental imperatives. So that means things like energy security, affordability, availability, reliability, competitiveness, innovation, environmental issues beyond the climate. And that's really tough to do. But in the absence of those integrated approaches, you have to basically be making climate policy as if energy mattered and energy policy as if climate mattered.
Yeah. You challenged Ed, so I think Ed has to have an opportunity to respond.
Monica, I'm glad. I don't want all academics out there speaking about climate and energy issues. I want you out there. So I'm glad we're on this panel together. So there is no blueprint, and there are different elements. If you're Canada, you want to draw from different elements. There are elements of the Norwegian model we can draw from. At the subnational level, there are elements of the California model we can draw from. How to use a low-carbon fuel standard to drive innovation and new companies, and ultimately economic growth. I'd look to Shell and back to Mallika. When I was on an advisory council to Shell Global, Shell had anointed 11 countries, and Mallika, I'm looking, I can't remember if the number's right, 11 countries that it decided were of importance to energy transition. India, China, Brazil, the UK, the Netherlands. Notably, Canada wasn't on that list, in spite of my great efforts and my lobbying efforts. But they've said, for a variety of reasons, these are countries where we're going to invest in because they can provide templates for the rest of the world.
Okay. Now, let's look a little bit into the future. That's our fourth topic, looking ahead. What can we expect in terms of this? We're talking about the conversation about energy right now, and especially nationally in Canada. What can we expect in terms of the tensions, the dynamics? I mean, how do you expect that conversation to evolve? Monica, I'm going to turn to you.
Well, not to sound too negative here, but I think this is going to be hard. But I think what's important is to identify where are those tensions likely to be and what can we try to do to address them. Partisan polarization, to my mind, is, it's a major obstacle. Puts people into camps that intentionally seek to have polarized, differentiated approaches to the issues. And then, when group identity and affiliation become the lens through which the issues are viewed rather than the evidence, it really makes it tough to make progress. And I would agree with what Ed said earlier. There's been a lot of trust, I think, that's been broken, that some of the kind of bridge building initiatives that took place in the past would be a lot more difficult to undertake right now. A couple of other key tensions I would point to going forward. The first relates to investor confidence. Canada's seen this in terms of the challenges when it comes to having a clear, predictable approach to energy project decision making. We've done a lot of work in this space. It's an ongoing challenge for Canada. I mean, we know it led to the federal government purchasing a pipeline and companies like Teck pulling the plug on investments. And some might say, hooray, Canada needs fewer oil and gas projects in the context of climate change. But the reality is that uncertainty applies to all energy infrastructure projects. And if we're serious about transition, it's going to take a lot of infrastructure, renewable power, electricity transmission, nuclear energy, you name it. So we're going to need a lot of investment in the coming years. That's going to be a huge issue. So our energy decision-making systems, and it's not only for investors, it's for communities as well. To Mallika's point, you need to bring people along. If communities don't feel that their views matter, In the Canadian context, that's not just municipalities, it's Indigenous communities and governments as well. Our decision systems for energy are going to be put to the test as never before, which is one of the reasons why we're focusing a lot of our work on that issue area.
And I'm going to turn back to you, Ed, before turning to Mallika. What approaches do we have to take to foster this national dialogue that we understand is going to be complicated? The issues are just super complicated and, of course, also constantly evolving. But what do we have to do to promote a conversation that is inclusive, that is productive, that is informative, perhaps just more of what we're doing now?
Sure, I'd say come up with a national energy strategy. And I say that we can use those three words together, and we've been able to use it for more than a decade without having to worry about the ghost of Pierre Trudeau the Elder coming out and haunting your virtual meeting room because it's too close to National Energy Program. Canada, and I think of something that my friend Stuart Algie of Smart Prosperity told me, thought he put it succinctly. Canada does a big think on its economic system about once in a generation. And the last time that we really did this was with free trade years ago. So whether you call it a Royal Commission or a National Energy Strategy Commission, we need an entity to take it on. And we need to think not just on a sector by sector basis, but we need to think of a system-wide basis. Map out our economic strengths. What do we need to do as a country? What tools can we use? What mechanisms do we have in place? And I've been sounding like a broken record crying out for this. We've had fits and starts. The Pan-Canadian framework got to a bit of it. Their renewal of the Pan-Canadian framework, we hope in December, we'll get to it. But it still isn't something that we really need. And to do that, frankly, getting back to the political point, we need Canadians demanding that our politicians do that.
And Ed, I want to ask you, because I personally feel like, as I'm a bit of a foreigner in Canada, being born and bred in Europe, and I sometimes feel like Canada's decentralized political structure, while it's of course a strength from a democratic point of view, can also be a challenge in terms of national vision and national strategies. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the federal government on many energy matters has only weak authority, because the power of the resources are actually in the hands of the provinces. And I live in a province here in Alberta where you see that power played out on a daily basis, including premiers going back generations, back to Peter Lougheed, saying, hands off our resources, that decision-making authority is ours. So this is when polarization amongst those energy and environmental leaders gets in the way. We had a brief period of kind of holding hands, singing Kumbaya together in the immediate COVID shutdown aftermath around Build Back Better. I think that has waned, and we need to find ways to get back there.
Great answer. Mallika, I'm going to turn to you to give us a little bit of global context again. You work in the Shell scenarios team, so you're in the business of basically ideating or perhaps envisioning different paths forward. What does this kind of work around energy scenarios and vision, what does that do to our energy collaboration, our understanding, and our conversations, frankly?
Yeah, so I do work, so I have the luxury of thinking long term, but the whole purpose of that is then to sort of help Shell think through some of the issues that are coming up. So when Paris Climate Agreement was signed in 2015, Shell supported that. And since then, we've got our commitments to become a net zero energy business by 2050. So following the Paris commitment in 2018, we launched our Sky scenario, which, as I said before, was sort of giving you an economic and what we thought technologically possible pathway to get to the Paris goals. Now, one thing that really stood out is that to get there, you could break the problem down into sort of 4 or 5 things that needed to happen. You needed to electrify a lot. So, you needed to build out a lot of electricity networks. You needed to then supply that electricity with low carbon electrons, so renewables, nuclear, but they had to be low carbon, not fossil, of supplying that electricity. Now, there are all these hard to electrify sectors like aviation or, heavy industry. And for those, you needed what we call low carbon molecules. So hydrogen, biofuels needed to play, again, moving the fossils out of the picture. We also looked at, you needed to have behavior change. You needed to have people being more energy efficient. You needed to have people taking on sort of low carbon options, choosing them when they were faced with with those choices. And then the final sort of bucket, if you like, was for those emissions that you really couldn't get rid of, where you did need fossils. You need some form of carbon removal. So whether that's man-made through carbon capture and storage, or it's natural through sort of carbon sinks, you needed those. Now the thing is, what that helped us with was you can debate how much you want to do of each, but though that's the set of things that need to happen in order for the system itself to decarbonize. So you can say we'll do more electrification, we don't like CCS, so we'll do a little less of that. But really the discussion is between these different levers, what you choose to do. But really you need to use all of these levers to make that transition. So that was quite an insight, and it helps sort of focus discussions with stakeholders, with governments, with others. So it's sort of had a sort of a framework to bring together the system-wide change that's needed in order to decarbonize.
Well, this is a lot, I think, perhaps to take in even for our audience. So we're going to start moving towards some calls to action. I'm going to give you each 30 seconds because, well, at TheFutureEconomy.ca, we like to have conversations and hear great insights, but we also like to get those clear calls to action. So I'm going to start with you, Monica, and basically asking you who must do what, and I guess when is immediately, to drive this, more collaborative, more constructive, more inclusive, and ultimately more effective conversation around energy transition in Canada.
Well, I'm going to quickly push back on the question in that, we tend to want for there to be silver bullets, and I just don't think that there are. I think it's going to take multiple different approaches, and that means all of us are going to have to do things now and on a continual basis. And to my mind, what's really key is these integrated approaches that, get beyond the silos, that really look at climate change policy as if energy mattered, energy policy as if climate change mattered.
Great, very clear. Ed?
Sure. So I believe that politicians succumb to public pressure. So we need to continue to make climate a top 3 issue going forward for any politician, including if we have a federal election next year. But we're not done there. If you ask Canadians now, are you prepared to spend money on climate, even if it comes, say, at the expense of investing in health or education or short-term economic growth? Most will say no. We actually need 30 to 40% of Canadians feeling strongly that strong measures must be taken to take rules and to spend money. And to do this, we admit that there will be an opportunity cost, but that over the long term, this is important. That's the next step where we need to go with the Canadian electorate.
Thank you, Ed. And Mallika, again, it's going to be interesting to hear your perspective on Canada sort of externally.
So yes, so I am aware that currently Canada is legislating its target to get to net zero by 2050, and so in that context, my plea or my call to action would be, as before, you need every part of society pulling together here. You need governments, business, consumers, citizens pulling together, and one can't wait for the other. We all need to start making changes at the same time. We can't wait. Business can't wait for government, and governments can't wait for consumers. We all need to be working together simultaneously to drive this change forward at the pace that's needed for Canada to decarbonize.
Thank you very much. Well, we're going to move to the Q&A section right now. We've received some really good ones, so brace yourselves, folks. The first one is going to be for you, Mallika, and it comes from Rachel Sampson with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And she says, Shell scenarios seem to assume a gradual, orderly transition. Have you considered the risk of market shifts that happen much faster than expected? And I'll ask you to answer in about a minute if you can.
Yes, so we do. I mean, of course, when you do scenarios, you're sort of assuming, a certain progression or changes that happen. But the whole point of scenarios is to pick up on the disruptive changes that could happen. So, if the scenarios, we have scenarios that pick up on very fast technological change, disruption in particular sectors like road transport in terms of, the shift to EVs. So the whole point, I guess, of the scenarios approach is to be able to capture the range of different outcomes that could happen as we go forward. And then from that, to look and see what does this mean from a Shell perspective, what we should be doing, and also from our conversations with our stakeholders and governments to say, what should we be talking about. So I think, the idea of scenarios is not to focus on any particular one, but is to test out the range or, the plausible range of outcomes that could happen and use that as a way to inform our decision making.
Great. I'm going to jump in quickly. I had the benefit of going to The Hague 3 times a year, meeting with the Shell executive team right up to Ben Van Burden and meeting with Jeremy Bentham, who's led the scenarios work. So I'd say check out the scenarios. They're terrific. But in terms of sort of the disruption, so Shell, I agree that we need to electrify mobility and heat to get to our climate targets. And Shell has become quickly an integrated gas producer to do that because we'll need gas for electricity. What I'd say, and again, I sound like a broken record, is Shell, I suspect that Shell has underestimated the precipitous decline in the cost of renewables. And my challenge to Mallika and her colleagues is you may have overweighted gas based on that because the cost curves of renewables and even large-scale renewables, wind and solar, is just in astounding decline right now.
I'm going to turn to you, Monica, and we're going to stay with renewables a little bit. How can we, no, sorry, actually not renewables. I mean the energy transition. How can we make it an inclusive energy transition and make sure that First Nations are front and center of the energy transition? Sorry for the mishap.
I think this is key, and I think the question, I like how it's framed in the sense that, so who is we? And if we is Indigenous communities themselves, I think that's the right starting place. I mean, we do a lot of work with Indigenous communities, and the extent to which they are, through organizations like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition and others, really, capacity building for their communities, developing Indigenous-led impact standards, working very closely with proponents to shape projects. I think that the calls are going to come from Indigenous communities themselves. And I think it's very much going to be up to our decision-making systems here in Canada to be ensuring that we're finding ways to work together on these issues. But there's an increasingly sophisticated, very impressive movement coming from Indigenous communities themselves, including on matters like ESG as well.
Mm-hmm. The next question is for you, Ed. It comes from Carla Skinner, PhD candidate at Dalhousie University, working on geothermal energy. That's what got me a little confused earlier about renewables. And so, Ed, how do you think we can get people aligned and working together across the country at all economic levels?
At all economic levels. Well, I think this is an academic going after me for the nasty things I've said about academics, Monica. But it's hard for me to say anything that doesn't sound trite. I'll repeat what I said. I think our elections are showing that Canadians at all economic levels, from all regions, from all ethnicities, are caring about this issue. And so they are going to continue to demand that. And all we have to do is ourselves, get up and frankly get invited to discussions like this and just try to feed the conversation. Or a shameless plug for my energy versus climate webinar and podcast is what we're trying to do. What we need to do, and going back to the last question, about, say, Indigenous Canadians, we can try to speak for them, but I've got plenty of friends from, say, Treaty 7 here, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Siksika, the Stonies, the Sarsi, and we need to be bringing their voices into conversations like this and doing it in a way that is culturally in keeping with how they want to communicate.
And I'm sure you'd agree, and all of you perhaps, that it's a conversation that, again, goes well beyond the energy sector. We also need collaboration with other sectors and try to build synergies and efficiencies like that, right?
Yeah, and I'd say put a plug. We focus on energy, some parts of manufacturing, like steel and cement. There's a huge opportunity to be had in steel and cement decarbonization. Some tremendous work being done, but it's not contentious. So we don't talk about it. We don't spill ink in newspapers about it. But we need to help our friends in those two sectors to really go further and further in their decarbonization ambitions.
The next question is for you, Mallika. It's from Natasha Stromberg. And I remember I connected with you, Natasha, on LinkedIn. So nice to have you on the call. She's an ex-commodity market regulator. And she says, or she asks, do you think that energy companies have a moral obligation to show leadership when it comes to the energy transition and not look only to government for leadership? I like that question.
Yes, and if I may take the liberty of going back to Ed's point about the renewables, I think, what I would say is that the scenarios are not, a planning tool for Shell. They are a way of opening up the company's eyes to the kinds of uncertainties that are there. I mean, we have chosen to take a target of becoming a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. Now that will require portfolio shifts. And so again, if we are, if renewables costs decline more than we anticipated, then that's where we'll move into. So I mean, to me, it's that's sort of the approach that we're taking in terms of investments that we actually make in response to these changes. And that sort of segues nicely into the question of whether we lead those changes or not. And I think there is there is an imperative, both morally as well as from a business perspective, to be ahead of the game in this energy transition. So I think, there is a real important role for government policies to come in to help support some of these shifts. The technologies and fuels you're looking at today for decarbonizing in 2050 are much more expensive than fossil fuels today. So there needs to be some incentives around how do you, shift and how do you get those at scale. Infrastructure is another area where I would say, governments have a role in getting that infrastructure in so that then when these fuels are there, then people can use them. But that said, I think it's a complete fallacy for businesses to wait for those frameworks to be in place before doing action. I think, as I said, sectoral coalitions, building up, getting into partnership with people in a sector, businesses in a sector, covering different elements of that sector. Like I gave the example of aviation, so talking to airports who have to bunker the fuel, talking to airlines who have to fly planes on the new fuels, and talking to companies like us who produce that new fuels. There is a lot that can be done for businesses getting together and driving, at least sort of demonstrating what that change looks like. What are the kinds of things that need to fall into place? So I think, to me, I completely sort of, agree with the premise, I think that was implied, that businesses shouldn't be waiting for policy frameworks to come in. There's a role for businesses to take action and demonstrate and give confidence to governments to then come in with policy frameworks that help scale up that action. So I think it's not just a moral imperative. I think it's also makes good business sense to do that.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah, it's and now I want to turn to Ed and actually Monica, both of you. This is another question from Rachel Sampson at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. She has good questions, I think. So she says Alberta and Saskatchewan are key to Canada's transition success. What does transition need to look like in those provinces to secure broad public support? Ed, I'll start with you and ask you to try to keep it to 30 seconds.
Sure. Well, I think we need to have frank conversations with people because right now what we're seeing is I think politicians are afraid to speak the truth. And that is transition, any way you look at it, means unfortunately those of our proud Albertans or folks in Saskatchewan in the oil and gas sector, there will just be less economic capacity to provide them with high-paying jobs. So we need to find another economic engine from where we can provide those high-paying jobs. I don't think we've figured that out. I don't think we're being honest with people, workers in the oil and gas sector here in Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Monica?
Well, I think this is a really important question, and I think one where there aren't easy answers for obvious reasons, but at the same time, I think scenarios are potentially really useful to think about as well, because there have, as Rachel, you would probably know, been pretty substantial strides in the oil and gas sector in terms of reducing emissions intensity, in terms of thinking about diversification of oil and gas towards other projects, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's bitumen beyond combustion, carbon fiber, and the like. And so I think there are not only perhaps some tough conversations to Ed's point, but also some really close look at where are the opportunities and how well are each of those provinces positioned to seize them.
Well, I could continue asking you questions for hours, but I think we all still lead very busy lives, even from home. I'm going to ask you one final one, though, all three of you, and I'll start with you, Mallika. What has resonated most with you during our conversation today? Have you learned anything? Hopefully, at least one thing.
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. I was just thinking about that because, I worked in the UK government. I joined them in 2006 when the Stern Review, which was the first sort of economic case for taking on climate change and tackling it, came out. And I was just reflecting how much the discussion has moved from then to now. I mean, at that point of time, people were like, what is this? And what are you trying to sell to us? Whereas now it's sort of, when we present scenarios, the response usually is, what can we do and how do we do it? So in some sense, that progression from what's this to how do we now fix this is, it's really heartening. And I can see that in this over the course of this panel discussion, and the sophistication of the thinking, that it's not just a technology play, it's not just an economics play, but the fact that it's a social play. I think that's just, to me, it really struck me as to how far along this discussion is in that, and how nuanced and sophisticated it is. And I think that's, at least from my perspective and the work I do, that's what you need. You need a whole society, whole system approach to solving this problem.
Ed, what have you learned today, or what sticks the most, let's say?
So I've enjoyed the conversation, and thanks to Monica and Mallika, thanks to you, Flo. What I've been reminded is when we stay at this high level in these conversations, it's easy for all of us to agree. We're still in Canada, I think, not doing a good enough job of saying, what does energy transition look like? What are our menus of possible energy futures? And then have pointed conversations around contentious topics like nuclear. For instance, what is the role of nuclear power in Canada's low carbon energy future? And if we had tackled that, I suspect between the three of us, we might have had very divergent views. So I would say in our conversations, we need to sort of keep striving to get to those tougher issues, and then just be very open to being challenged on our assumptions.
That's great. And I'll end with you, Monica. What have you learned, or what has stuck with you most today?
Well, I think fairly complementary to what's already been stated. I was going to say, actually, as Mallika said, sort of the evolution of the conversation. I think, as I noted earlier, it's this movement from the what to the how. I think we are very fortunate, and we need to, I think, remember that in Canada. For the most part in Canada, there is very strong consensus about the need the need for climate action. I mean, we've recently done some public opinion polling work that even in the midst of COVID, even when we push Canadians on there could be trade-offs with climate action in terms of the economy, there's still more support for climate action than not. So I think, but it's the moving from the what to the how. And that's where I see this conversation, and I would like to hope that this is, a microcosm of broader conversations that are happening, but that shift from the what to the how, it's that how piece that's going to be really challenging, and that's where we need to be turning our minds now, and it really does take a lot of different perspectives brought to bear.
Speaking of perspectives, we're going to put our final poll on right now and sort of see if people's views have evolved a little bit. While this shows up on your screen, I'm going to say a big thank you to Mallika for joining us from Delhi and for collaborating with you in the past weeks towards this. By the way, there is an interview with her on TheFutureEconomy.ca. So if you want to learn a bit more about those scenarios and those collaborations that are needed, go and check that out. Ed, thank you very much. It was nice to see you again. I think I interviewed you maybe 3 or 4 years ago. You were on one of our panels as well in Calgary. Great to see you again. And Monica, nice to meet you and get to know you around this super important conversation. Thank you very much to the three of you.
Now, my pleasure. Thank you, Flo.
You're very welcome. We'll do this again. I'm just waiting for the results of the poll. I'm just going to say that if you've enjoyed today's panel, visit thefutureeconomy.ca to check out, as I said, Mallika's interview, and we have over 400 interviews on the site on energy, but on many other topics. So go check them out. Let's see, I have the results. So do you feel more hopeful that we can have constructive conversations about energy in Canada? 63%, by far the largest proportion, say somewhat agree. And the rest is more or less, very few people disagree, I guess that's the message. So that's good news, more positive than negative. And there's another question about Shell. I'll let you guys answer that. And again, say thank you very much to everyone who participated in this. Thank you very much to Shell for making this possible. Clearly wouldn't be possible otherwise. The next panel in our series will be on Indigenous participation in Canada's energy transition on December 8th at the same time. For all those who have participated today, you'll be getting our notification. Feel free to share it, of course. Sign up for our newsletter as well to get those updates on a regular basis on this and on other content. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook to join our engaged community and those types of conversations. I think this concludes our session for today. At just 3 minutes over time. I want to, thank you again so very much, and keep well, stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye now.